In the narrowest hours of the night, when the wind moaned through arrow slits like the cry of distant ghosts, and even the guardsmen on the battlements blinked heavy with sleep, the life of the servant did not halt. It only changed tempo. Some duties, unlike the day's visible bustle, unfolded in shadows and silence. Castle life was built upon unceasing rhythm, and it demanded vigilance even in darkness. Deep within the kitchen's lower hearth, beyond the reach of torchlight, a teenage boy named Will sat huddled beside the embers, his task to keep the fire alive until dawn. Should the coals die before the cook returned, the entire kitchen would fall behind schedule, and Will's failure would cost him more than a day's work. It could cost him a week's meals, or his place in the castle entirely. There was no trust, no leniency for error, not in the cold calculus of medieval service. Everything was a test. Every day a silent trial. Those who lasted did so by becoming invisible and indispensable all at once. Like the coals Will guarded neither flame nor ash, just steady, quiet endurance in the upper castle. The noble family slept in rooms lined with tapestries and warmed with braziers. Outside their chambers, servants kept watch silently in alcoves. One such girl, Emma, only 16, stood guard not with sword or shield, but with alert ears and watchful eyes. Her duty was to listen for any stirring from the ladies' room, a call for water, or a blanket adjusted, or a candle relit. She could not sit, she could not speak, and should she drift to sleep and be caught, she would be stripped of her position and sent to tend the stables or worse the cesspits. Emma had come to the castle as an orphan, one of many taken in under the Lord's mercy. In truth, this mercy was merely a way to harvest cheap labor. Orphaned children were often taken into service, not out of charity, but out of economy. They had no family to protect them, no inheritance to claim, and no leverage with which to bargain. They were clay to be shaped or ground down, and Emma, sharp-eyed and silent, had learned to mold herself into what the castle required. Elsewhere, below the chapel, the monks began their nocturnal offices. The soft chant of Latin prayers drifted through stone like incense, through air. Was here that Giles, a boy assigned to the chaplain's service, moved in quiet ritual. He lit candles, polished chalices, and swept cold stone floors where no one ever walked barefoot. The clergy, for all their piety, were no gentler to their servants than the lords. In fact, their punishments often came with sanctimony stripes given in the name of correction. Silence demanded in the name of humility. When dawn finally crept across the horizon and the first sliver of light pierced the sky, it was not a call to peace but to preparation. The castle would wake again soon, and the first bell would echo from the tower to summon all to their stations. 100 lives stirred at once, lives that slept fully clothed and rose at the command of bells rather than dreams. Thomas, his eyes gritty and limbs stiff, woke from a restless half-sleep. His joints ached as he stretched, and he felt the familiar pang of hunger before his feet even touched the floor. Morning brought no rest, only new labors. Today, his duties began in the stables. Lord Everard's warhorse, a towering beast named Fenric, required grooming before the noble's morning ride. The stables were loud and alive, the earthy smell of manure mixing with hay, sweat, and leather. Horses stamped, whinnied, and snorted. Clouds of steam into the chilled air. Stable boys moved among them like dancers, dodging hooves, whispering soothing words, lifting buckets. Fenric, more muscle than flesh, nearly kicked Thomas when he approached with the currycomb, but Thomas didn't flinch. He'd learned early that fear had a scent, and animals and nobles fed on it. By the time the hooves were cleaned, the saddle buckled, and the reins polished, the sun had risen fully and the castle was pulsing with activity. Servants like Thomas moved through corridors like blood through veins, unseen but essential. He helped bring firewood to the laundress, who was boiling linens in huge iron vats in the yard. The smoke stung his eyes and clung to his clothes, and the heat scalded his arms even through the damp sleeves. Nearby, other servants scrubbed and beat the castle's rushes. These were not mere floor coverings. They were the medieval version of carpet, laid thick with straw and herbs to keep the chill and stench at bay. But over weeks, these rushes grew foamatted with grease, animal droppings, and whatever else had fallen from the hands of careless nobles. Once every month, they had to be replaced, and it was the lowest servants who did it. Later that morning, the castle prepared for a visiting baron and his retinue. This meant extra meals, extra beds, and extra scrutiny. Every corner had to gleam, every dish polished to reflection. The linen tablecloths used only for such honored guests had to be pressed by hand with hot stones. Thomas, Alice, Will, and Emma were all conscripted into this display, not because their names were known, but because their mistakes would be in the great hall. The trestle tables were laid with the best cutlery the castle owned, including silverware. So rarely used it had grown tarnished in storage. Thomas was ordered to scrub the pieces until they shone, his fingers raw by the time he was done. Will was sent to the cook to assist with skinning eels for the soup. Alice was instructed to arrange a garland of winter berries and holly for the guest chamber, more decorative than practical, but it gave the illusion of hospitality. Emma, meanwhile, was tasked with changing the bedding in the visiting baron's chamber, a task which, while seemingly mundane, was fraught with danger. Should a single louse be found, or a stain missed on the mattress, it would be seen as an insult to the guest and a personal failure on Emma's part. They moved in silence, trained not to speak unless spoken to. Laughter, whispering, even smiling, at the wrong time could earn reprimand. They had learned to listen for footsteps on stone, to know which voice approached from which corner, to vanish into alcoves at the first shout of "make way." Yet there were moments of connection, rare and quiet. A shared glance, a crust of bread smuggled from the kitchen, a whispered joke that made someone's shoulders shake and restrained laughter. These were the small rebellions, the private acts of resistance that made the life bearable. By evening, when the visiting baron arrived, the entire castle had been transformed. Musicians played by the hearth, minstrels sang songs of conquest, and nobles laughed over meat and wine. But behind every plate served and goblet filled, a servant stood ready, unseen, waiting for a signal or a gesture. And if the baron left happy, it would be the lord who received praise. If he did not, it would be the servants who bore the blame that night. After the feast, after the cleanup, after the bedding was shaken out and the boots lined up and the fires banked low, Thomas found his way back to his niche. He was too tired to eat, too numb to dream. He lay on the straw, eyes open in the dark, listening once more to the low, endless breath of the castle. And in his silence, he understood a truth that all castle servants eventually learned, it not that they were invisible, but that they were meant to be. The castle was never truly silent, even in the deepest watches of the night. When the nobles had retired to their beds and the torches were dimmed to embers, the place exhaled, stone groaning from the cold, iron hinges creaking under the weight of ancient wood, and pharaoh voices murmuring through the walls like memories refusing to sleep. For the servants, it was in this dark interlude that their exhaustion took shape, not in rest, but in routine. A kind of second shift emerged, invisible and thankless. The linens of the feast had to be washed and hung to dry before frost stiffened them. Chamber pots, full and reeking, had to be hauled to the pits. The great hall, littered with bones and bread crusts and goblets tipped on their sides, had to be returned to a semblance of order. And all of it before the Lord stirred again. That evening's feast had left a trail of chaos. Roasted boar had been served with spiced wine. Pigeons stuffed with herbs had been carved beside platters of barley, and trenchers of stale bread had soaked up the sauces until they resembled clay. Thomas had carried heavy trays from the scullery to the high table, stepping carefully on the rushes-strewn floor, hoping none of the dogs lurking underfoot tripped him. One spill, just one, and he would not see the inside of the castle again. But he had succeeded, at least for the moment. Now, in the hours after the feast, his arms trembled under the weight of the wooden trenchers, and the skin on his fingers peeled from handling boiling water. The scullery was alive with steam, smoke, and curses. Mistress Enid's voice cut through the fog like a blade. Slower hands mean longer nights. She barked, slamming a cleaver onto the table for emphasis. And we don't rest until it's done. Near Thomas, Alice worked in silence, her hair damp with sweat as she scrubbed the residue of wine and grease from the floor with a rag and lye. The skin on her knuckles had cracked, revealing raw flesh, but she didn't flinch. Beside her, Will toiled over a tub of goblets, dipping each in near boiling water before drying them with burlap. There were no soft cloths for such work. Only what was available. Only what was sufficient in a corner. A younger boy named Edric wept softly, his hands too small to lift the heavy cauldron of stew that had hardened into a gluey mass. No one comforted him, not because they lacked compassion, but because sympathy was a luxury they couldn't afford. Time was merciless, and kindness slowed you down. Later that night, after the scullery was returned to its grim but passable order, Thomas was summoned unexpectedly to the steward's quarters. He had not been there since his arrival, and fear coiled in his belly as he made his way through the hidden servants' passage that curved behind the main stair. The steward, Master Oswin, was not a man known for indulgence. He kept records with ink-stained fingers and eyes that missed nothing. Thomas stood before him, damp and trembling, his tunic smelling of smoke and meat. Oswin didn't look up immediately. Instead, he traced a line down a parchment with a quill before speaking. "You've kept steady hands at the table," he said at last. "No drops, no wasted ale, no broken plates." Then, looking up, he added, "I've noticed." Thomas wasn't sure how to respond. Praise, when it came, was usually a prelude to a demand. "You'll serve in the upper corridor now," Oswin said, already returning to his ledgers. "Foot service. To the lady and her daughters. You'll start at sunrise. Do not speak unless addressed. Do not look them in the eye. Do not forget your place. With that, the steward waved him away, and Thomas left, stunned. The upper corridor was another world, entirely. While still bound in stone and wood, it bore the illusion of grace. Tapestries hung from the walls depicting saints, battles, and myths stitched in silk thread. The floors were cleaner, the air tinged with the scent of rose oil and tallow candles rather than piss and smoke. The servants who worked here stood straighter, spoke softer, and vanished more quickly when footsteps echoed. When dawn came, Thomas stood outside the lady's solar, tunic pressed and hair combed with fingers dampened in the wash basin. He waited until the lady's maid, a middle-aged woman named Isolde, opened the door and signaled him in. The room was warm with the glow of coals and layered with cushions and embroidered cloths. On the far side sat Lady Agnes, pale and severe, her long auburn hair brushed by her daughter, a girl no older than Alice. Though her hands had never scrubbed a floor, Thomas bowed. He stood perfectly still, eyes fixed on the ground. That's the new one, the lady said, without looking. Yes, my lady, Isolde replied. The one from the kitchens. Agnes gave a nod. He looks obedient. We'll see if it lasts. Thomas remained silent, heart thudding in his chest. He had not been dismissed, so he did not move. From that day forward, his life changed, not easier, but different. He was no longer handling meat and firewood. Now he fetched brushes, laid out garments, and waited at the edges of the solar to be summoned by a gesture or a glance. He heard conversations not meant for his ears, whispers of alliances, gossip of neighboring lords, rumors of war, but he said nothing. He stored every word in silence, knowing that trust was brittle, and betrayal, real or imagined, was punished swiftly. He began to understand the hierarchy of silence. Those who served closest to power were expected to be the quietest. The wrong word could lead to a whipping or worse, a disappearance. He had once known a girl named Annette, whose tongue was too quick. She had laughed too loudly when a knight stumbled drunk at the feast. By morning, she was gone. Some said she had been sent to a convent. Others whispered that she'd been thrown from the battlements in the dead of night. No one asked aloud. No one wanted to share her fate. As days passed, Thomas learned the rhythms of this new post. When the lady rose, when she took her broth, when the daughters bathed, when the Lord visited the chamber, every hour had its own set of invisible duties. There was no room for fatigue. A misplaced shawl or a wrinkled hem could result in a blow, or a slap. A servant's failure was always visible. A servant's success was never remarked upon. Evenings brought him back to the servant quarters, where he slept now with the others assigned to the upper floor a step above the scullery. But not by much. The chamber was cramped, and the straw was cleaner, but still shared with lice. He lay beside Will and Alice, who whispered in the dark about the feast to come at the equinox. There were rumors that the king's cousin might visit, and with him knights, musicians, nobles, and more danger than any of them could afford. Alice spoke of escape sometimes. She had an older brother who had fled the castle and found work as a carter in the village. But to leave meant risking pursuit, and if caught, the punishment was brutal. Branding, whipping, disfigurement, sometimes even death. The castle did not give up its labor lightly. And yet, Thomas wondered, What lay beyond the forested hills he had only seen from the battlements, beyond the cold stone walls and the smoke-stained ceilings. Would the sun feel warmer in a field untouched by shadow? But the thought vanished as quickly as it came, drowned by the familiar sound echoing through the floor, the low, metallic groan of the steward's bell. It was calling someone, perhaps him. Thomas sat up slowly, in a world built on obedience and silence. Dreams were dangerous things, and tonight, as always, duty came before sleep. Morning in the upper corridor was less violent than in the scullery, but no less relentless. It began not with shouting, but with a knock. 3 sharp raps from Isilda's knuckles against the thick oak door of the servant chamber, always before. First light, always precise. The girls stirred first alleys, rising from her straw mat with practiced ease, already smoothing her shift. Thomas followed, hands trembling slightly as he shook the cold from his fingers. They had minutes no more to wash their faces with frigid water from the shared basin, to tie their tunics tight, and to assume the poise demanded of those who served the lady's household. There was no tolerance for sluggishness. The lord's daughters were to be dressed before the 3rd bell, their hair braided and their slippers placed at the foot of their beds, warmed with cloth. If the braids were uneven, or if the slippers were cold, it reflected not on the daughters, but on the servants who prepared them. Thomas had been assigned to carry in the morning Trastine broth, oatcakes, sometimes a soft cheese if the cook was in a generous mood. He moved with exactness, his every footstep measured, his hand steady as he passed the trays into the solar dot inside. Lady Agnes sat already dressed, her expression as pale and unreadable as ever. Her youngest daughter, Cecily, sat upon a cushioned bench, her tiny foot poking out from under a heavy velvet gown as Alice crouched before her to slip on her shoes. The girl stared blankly at Thomas, as if trying to decide whether he was real. Then, without warning, she giggled. "He has hair like a badger," she said loudly, pointing, "all flat and funny." Thomas froze, unsure if laughing would worsen the moment or ease it. He bowed his head, lips pressed shut. Alice's hands stilled for just a second, then resumed their motion with calm purpose. Lady Agnes did not react. She never did. Praise or reprimand were rare from her lips. The servants were not truly people in her world, they were functions, like candles or combs. They were simply meant to work and disappear. By midday, the castle was alive with clamor. The visiting baron had requested a hunting expedition, and the household had exploded into preparation. Horses were to be saddled, provisions packed, falcons hooded, and horns polished. The nobleman would leave at dawn the next morning, but the work for it began now. Thomas was sent to the armory to help polish the stirrups and buckle the leather straps on a dozen saddles. His arms ached from the repetition, from the smell of oil and metal that coated his palms, but he did not slow. The steward was making his rounds today. In the armory, squires and stable boys jostled for space. One of the older squires, a brute named Ranulph, bumped into Thomas with a sneer. "Careful, rat. Don't touch what's not yours," he spat, his breath thick with the scent of mead from the night before. Thomas didn't answer. He had learned that silence was safer than defiance. But later, as Ranulph passed too close to the fire where a branding iron glowed for the horses, Thomas allowed his arm to slip just slightly, brushing against the squire's back. Ranelf hissed, spinning around to cuff him, but the moment had passed. No one saw, or, if they did, they said nothing. It was a small victory, petty and dangerous. But it was his dot in the kitchens. Enid bellowed orders at a new girl who had scalded herself trying to empty a cauldron. The girl cried out, dropping the pot, and its contents splattered across the stone. "You'll eat that slop if you waste another bite." Enid roared, and dragged her away by the wrist. No one intervened. Even Alice, walking past with a bundle of clean cloths, did not stop. She met Thomas's eyes briefly, just for a second, and shook her head so faintly it might have been mistaken for a twitch. "Don't." That's what the look said. Just don't. Punishments in the kitchen were crueler than most. Not because the offenses were graver, but because the environment was more brutal, more immediate. Knives were always nearby. Fire always burned. Everything was loud, fast, and fueled by panic. Servants who failed in the kitchens were rarely reassigned. They vanished, whether dismissed, beaten into injury, or quietly sent away. No one knew for sure. But their absence was never explained. That night, the lady requested music. A minstrel had arrived with the Baron's entourage, and his fingers danced across the strings of a lute with practiced ease. Nobles gathered in the great hall, sipping spiced wine, wrapped in fur cloaks, their laughter echoing against the stone. Thomas stood in the corner, still as a shadow, ready to refill a goblet or pass a tray as needed. He could not help but stare, just a little, at the minstrels. Not out of envy for their fine clothing, but for their freedom. They were not servants. They were guests, of a sort. They sang for coin, not command. They were permitted to speak, to smile, to leave. When the music ended, and the nobles drifted away, Thomas returned to the scullery to scrub goblets in silence. His hands stung from the hot water. His back curved in fatigue. But his mind, curiously, was alive. He found himself humming a piece of the melody the minstrel had played, softly, so softly that even Alice, scrubbing beside him, did not hear. It was in these moments rare, accidental, that he remembered he was still something more than what the castle made him. Beneath the grime, beneath the obedience, there was still a boy who could dream of song. Elsewhere in the castle, deeper and colder, in the servants' latrine yards, Gamillan the old man Thomas had met his first week sat beneath a flickering lantern, coughing into a rag already stained with blood. The winter had begun its slow siege, and the castle's thick walls could not protect the weak from what festered inside. Gamillan's breath rattled like dry leaves, and no one came to check on him. He had once tended to horses for a king. Now, he couldn't lift a pail without trembling. By morning, he was dead. There was no ceremony, no mass, no mourning cloth, just a wooden cart rolled into the servants' quarters before dawn, and the order to lay Gamillan's body on it. And another boy lifted him, wrapped in rough cloth, and wheeled him to the pit behind the kennels. Thomas watched, silent, as the wheels creaked past. Later that day, his bed was already occupied by a new boy, younger and thinner than he had been. When he first arrived, the castle made no room for ghosts. It rained for 3 days, without pause. The kind of cold, soaking rain that found its way through even the thickest stone and turned the earth to sludge and the corridors to dripping halls of mildew and misery. Inside the castle, the damp clung. To everything, the rushes on the floor swelled and grew foul. The linens refused to dry, and the smoke from the hearths hung heavy in the air, choking instead of warming. It was during this sodden gloom that Thomas began to feel something beneath the dull rhythm of his daily toilet change, subtle but real. He was no longer watched quite as closely, no longer barked at as quickly. His hands moved with practiced confidence, his steps made no sound. And when he entered the solar with the morning tray, Lady Agnes no longer glanced at him as if he were a dog come in from the mud. She did not glance at him at all. In a strange way, this felt like success. But with the illusion of rising came new dangers. The closer a servant drew to power, the more precarious their footing became. One misstep could bring ruin swifter than a fall on the kitchen's wet stones. Thomas had seen it happen. There had been a boyuan signed to carry the Lord's cloak during the equinox procession. One wrong tug, one foot misplaced, and the hem dragged through the mud. The Lord's wrath was immediate and public. Ewan's head had been shaven and he was whipped in the courtyard, then sent to tend the pigs. Thomas never saw him again, so when Lady Agnes handed Thomas a sealed letter and ordered him to deliver it to the steward personally, he accepted with silent dread. The parchment was stiff, bound with a wax seal pressed by her own ring. It smelled faintly of rose oil and smoke. She didn't explain its contents. She didn't need to. The command was clear. And if the letter were to be lost, opened, delayed, he would be blamed. Not the wind, not a horse, not fate. Him. He walked swiftly through the gallery, down the spiral stairs, and into the steward's office, where Master Oswin sat with his ledgers and his ever-watchful eyes. The steward took the letter without a word, cracked the seal with a small ivory knife, and read. For a moment, his brow furrowed. Then he looked at Thomas, expression unreadable. Wait outside. Thomas obeyed, standing stiffly beside the stone archway as voices rose behind the door, muffled, clipped, but unmistakably sharp. The lady had written something urgent, something that required deliberation. Perhaps it was about the approaching feast, or perhaps something else entirely. A servant never asked. Curiosity was a luxury afforded only to those who did not live at the mercy of another's temper. When the door reopened, Oswin stepped into the light and looked down at him. You will assist the chamberlain tomorrow, at the west gate. Be there, before the sun rises. Thomas nodded once, then returned to his duties. The west gate was far from the elegant stone of the keep. It was the entry used by tradesmen and peddlers, where carts arrived laden with barrels of salted fish, sacks of barley, bolts of wool, and sometimes cages of fowl that clucked and flapped wildly in protest. It smelled of dung and wet leather. The guards there were less noble, more pragmatic, and the rules of service shifted accordingly. At dawn, he arrived to find the chamberlain already inspecting a delivery from the neighboring estate, a half-dozen carts, each covered in damp cloth, loaded with supplies for the feast 3 days away. Thomas's job was not to greet or speak, it was to record. With charcoal and a slate, he marked the weight of barrels, the names of goods, and the arrival times of every cart. He worked beside a girl he had never met before, kitchen scribe, named Bess, her fingers stained with ink and her sleeves rolled high despite the cold. She did not look at him for the first hour. But then, without warning, she whispered. "They'll short the flour. They always do. Watch." And sure enough, the next cart carried only 3 sacks, not 4, though the tally listed 4. The chamberlain, distracted by the driver's questions, didn't notice. Thomas did. He turned to Bess, brows raised. "They think we're stupid," she said. "They always do." They spent the morning like that, silent, swift, marking not just what came in, but what didn't. By midday, his hands were blackened from charcoal, and his back ached from stooping over the slate, but he had felt something strange, something rare. Not joy, not even pride, just usefulness. The kind that mattered. And in the eyes of the chamberlain, who said nothing as he read Thomas's notes, but nodded once, that usefulness had been recognized. Later, back in the scullery, he was sent to clean out the poultry cellar. It was a grim task. The hens were loud, the straw fetid with droppings, and the stench unbearable. But in that moment, even the stink seemed less important. He'd seen something of the castle's bones, the way goods flowed in, were measured, manipulated, hidden. The way trust was currency. He carried that knowledge like a small flame beneath his tunic. Alice noticed something different as they crossed paths in the corridor that evening. "You've seen something," she said. "I've seen the West Gate," he replied, and they both smiled, faintly, briefly. That night, back in the quarters, Will told a story he'd heard from a traveling jester who passed through the village last summer. It was about a nobleman cursed to serve in his own kitchens for 7 years before he could regain his title. The other boys laughed and jeered at the absurdity of it. But Thomas lay in the straw, staring at the beams above him, wondering what it would be like to see a noble forced to peel turnips with frozen fingers, outside. The rain still fell, and the castle moaned with the weight of the wind. Somewhere in the halls above, a noble child cried out in her sleep, and a nursemaid hushed her with lullabies. But down below, in the belly of the castle, where the light did not reach and dreams were thin and sharp-edged, the servants slept without song, without comfort. Only the knowledge that morning would come again, and with it, another round of silence and sweat. The feast approached like a storm on the horizon. Everyone saw it coming, and no one could stop it. It consumed the castle from within, altering the rhythm of daily life, commanding a tempo faster, harder, and more dangerous than anything before. Its days melted together. Sleep became a luxury whispered about, but rarely achieved. And through it all, the servants moved like ghosts in a machine, spinning, lifting, scrubbing, sewing, bowing. Every corridor echoed with instructions barked by the steward. Every courtyard was filled with the groan of cartwheels and the whinnies of restive horses. Thomas, now marked as a reliable hand, found himself caught deeper in the machinery. He no longer carried wood or turned spits. Now he was trusted with handling the inventory before it reached the cook's hands. He stood beside the chamberlain. Again, this time at the castle's rear entrance, checking barrels of salted eel, baskets of apples, bolts of cloth dyed in rich crimsons and forest greens. Everything that entered passed under his eye. He made no decisions. He gave no orders. But his presence meant the lady's command had extended downward. The servants noticed, and with that came tension. Not all servants welcomed one of their own being lifted, even slightly. There were glances now sideways, measuring. Even Will, once easy with his jokes and shared crusts of bread, had grown quieter. Thomas didn't blame him. Proximity to power meant distance from everyone else. One couldn't serve the lady and stay truly among the others. It wasn't permitted. It wasn't safe. Still, Thomas moved forward. Every morning, he was summoned earlier. Every evening, dismissed later. When not checking goods, he was in the hall with the steward, learning the seating arrangement for the high table. He was told the names of minor barons, the colors of their banners, the order of their precedence. He memorized it all. He didn't know why they were telling him. He only knew he had to remember. The night before the feast, there was no sleep. The castle shone with torchlight from within and without. The cooks moved like generals through a battlefield of boiling pots and crackling fires. The air was so thick with the scent of roasted game and honey-glazed fowl that the very stones seemed to sweat it. Alice, pale and feverish with exhaustion, worked in the great chamber with 3 other girls, stitching new banners to hang from the balcony. Her fingers bled from the needle pricks, and still she sewed lips tight. Shoulders hunched, Thomas passed her only once during that long night. Their eyes met. Neither of them spoke. By the following dusk, the feast began. The nobles arrived on horseback, cloaked in furs and velvet. The portcullis was raised with ceremony, trumpets blaring, and banners fluttered in the sharp winter wind. Inside, the hall had been transformed. The rushes were fresh and sweetened with dried herbs. The torches burned brighter than ever before, casting gold across the stone walls. Tables were draped in clean linen, and the centerpiece a roasted peacock with feathers reattached and a crown placed upon its blue head glimmered with symbolic opulence. Thomas stood at the edge of the hall, dressed in a plain but newly mended tunic. He was assigned to serve at the high table, land honor, if such things existed for servants. He carried goblets of wine to the barons and bishops. Listening carefully for signs, an empty glass raised, a nod, a glance. He never spoke. His presence was supposed to be background, useful but invisible. But the lady noticed. "Thomas," she said quietly as he bent to refill her goblet. He froze, unsure if she meant to dismiss or scold. But her voice, though cold, was not angry. "You will remain until the final bell. No mistakes." He bowed, lower than necessary. "Yes, my lady." Hours passed. Music swelled and faded. Laughter rang, sharp as swordplay. Nobles grew drunk and boastful, and the hall filled with that strange joy that only the powerful can afford. Joy built atop 100 invisible shoulders holding up the stage. Near midnight, a troubadour performed a tale of chivalry. Knights slaying dragons, rescuing maidens. The crowd applauded. But behind the pillars, Thomas saw one of the kitchen girls, Marion, sneak a cup of wine from a platter meant for the nobles. A tiny act, barely a sip, but it was seen. Later she was dragged from the servants' hall by the steward's assistant, her screams muffled by the stone. Thomas didn't see her again. The next morning, he passed her blanket, folded neatly, placed on the floor where she had once slept. That was all. When the feast finally ended, and the torches were doused one by one, Thomas remained. Cleaning, clearing, obeying. His back ached. His fingers bled. But his mind burned. He was being watched, tested, groomed for something. Not nobility. That was impossible. But a different sort of place. Closer to the steward. trusted by the lady, and that, he knew, was both an honor and a trap. The closer one stood to the fire, the more quickly one could burn. The next morning, before the sun rose, he was summoned by name, not by a shout from the corridor or a whisper in the servants' hall, but by the steward himself, Thomas, to the chapel. Now, he went quickly, boots still damp from the feast's cleanup. The chapel was empty, lit only by a single candle on the altar. The priest, Father Aldwin, stood in his brown robes, hands folded. The steward was beside him. They did not look at Thomas as he entered. Instead, the priest gestured to the altar. "You will assist me in preparing the sacred vessels for the Lord's communion," Aldwin said, voice low and smooth. Thomas blinked. This was not a punishment, nor a reward. It was something else entirely. To serve the priest in the chapel was a mark of highest trust. The Lord's private spiritual moments were sacred. Only the quietest, most careful servants were ever permitted. Near them, yes, Father, Thomas said, his voice no louder than breath. They taught him how to hold the chalice, how to lay the cloth without creasing, how to light the incense without letting it flare too brightly. They told him nothing more. That night, when he returned to the servants' quarters, he didn't lie on the straw immediately. He sat for, while instead, listening to the breathing of the others, the soft snoring of Will, the shifting of Alice in the dark. He stared at his hands, blistered and blackened, and tried to remember if they had always looked this way. He couldn't. He wondered how many others had started as he had, lifting wood, carrying trenchers, watching quietly. How many had climbed, how many had disappeared. He lay down at last, and in the stone-cold dark of the castle's belly, Thomas dreamed of the chapel's candle, the only flame that had not burned him. The chapel's stillness was unlike any other place in the castle. It breathed a different air, dry, solemn, almost suspended in time, while the kitchens cracked with fire and sweat, and the great hall thrummed with laughter and lies. The chapel whispered in silence. Its stone arches curled like frozen waves above the altar, and the air always smelled faintly of wax, oil, and dust. To serve there was not to labor, but to vanish. And that was exactly what Thomas was learning to do. Father Aldwin was a quiet man, lean and pale, with long fingers that moved like smoke. He did not strike, did not shout, and yet his presence was as heavy as a blacksmith's hammer. He spoke in short, precise phrases, and he expected the same. Every object in the chapel had a purpose, and every movement in its service was a kind of prayer. Thomas found it strangely comforting. The same tray he carried in the great hall might hold a gilded chalice here, but in this space no one threw wine in anger or cursed the boy who delivered it. Here, even the nobility bowed their heads. The duties were simple, yet sacred. Thomas would wake before dawn to polish the silver vessels, his breath fogging the metal as he worked by the single flame of the sanctuary candle. He refilled the oil lamps and swept the flagstones until not a speck of soot remained. He prepared the incense, a blend of resin and spice that Father Aldwin mixed by hand and guarded like a secret. Once, Thomas accidentally spilled a pinch. The priest said nothing. But the next morning, the incense cupboard was locked, and the key hung from a chain around the priest's neck. A lesson. The Lord himself began appearing more often. Not in grand procession, not as the booming voice of the feast hall, but alone, cloaked and quiet. He would kneel on the cold stone, his broad shoulders hunched, his face obscured by the hood. Thomas was told to remain still when the Lord prayed, not to breathe too loudly, not to shift his weight, to exist and yet not exist. It was, in those moments, watching a man who ruled hundreds whisper his fears into silence, that Thomas first understood the nature of power. It was not armor or banners or gold. It was secrecy. It was distance. It was the ability to bend others into silence. He, Thomas the servant, was beginning to learn the rules of the unseen world, the one where true decisions were made. But outside the chapel, life for the others remained brutal and loud. Winter deepened. The courtyard turned to a slick crust of ice. The outer walls groaned under the weight of frost. Inside, the fires were fed constantly, yet the cold slipped through the stones like fingers. Alice developed a cough dry at first, then deep, rattling. She still worked, still stitched and scrubbed and bowed, but the red in her cheeks faded, and her hands trembled more often. Thomas noticed. He began sneaking crusts from the chapel's private bread stores, the thick, dense loaves reserved for the priest. He wrapped them in cloth and left them near Alice's blanket when no one was watching. She never said anything. But once, as they passed in the corridor, her fingers brushed his for the briefest moment. It was thanks enough. One morning the steward summoned Thomas directly. Not a message, not a barked command, but a personal request. You'll accompany the lady to the outer bailey today, Oswin said. She wishes to inspect the herb garden and walk the southern wall. Thomas bowed. Shall I prepare a blanket, my lord? You shall prepare not to speak, the steward replied, and bring no opinion with you. That will be sufficient. It was the first time Thomas walked beside the lady outside the keep. She moved slowly, gloved hands folded in front of her, her fur-lined cloak dragging slightly behind on the frozen ground. He stayed 3 paces behind her, eyes lowered. At times, she would pause to sniff a shriveled stalk of thyme or to point with disdain at a patch of yellowed rosemary. They did not speak, but as they reached the wall, she stopped. The wind pulled at her cloak, and Thomas saw her grip the stone for balance. She looked out over the forest, the skeletal trees black against the snow. For a long while, she said nothing. Then, softly, "You were an orphan, yes." Thomas's throat tightened. He nodded once. "So was I," she said. "Before I was married. Before I had a title." She turned her head, not toward him, but toward the wind. "But no one ever calls a lady a servant, even when she is given away like a piece of bread." Thomas dared a glance at her face, pale, unreadable, like marble left in a snowstorm. "You're not clever," she continued. "Not yet, but you're quiet. That's more useful." She walked on. Thomas followed, unsure whether the words were praise, warning, or simply memory set adrift. That night, a boy tried to run. Not Thomas, not Will, a boy named Rafe, no older than 12. They found him near the edge of the woods, boots half frozen, one hand twisted where he'd fallen. The guards dragged him back by the collar, mud streaking his tunic, tears carving rivers through the dirt on his cheeks. They tied him to the whipping post at dawn. The whole castle was made to watch, not just the servants, the grooms, the cooks, even the steward, even the lady. From a high window, the Lord spoke the sentence himself. 10 lashes for theft, 10 for flight. The boy screamed after the third. By the 7th, he passed out. They doused him in cold water and began again. When it was done, he was left slumped in the snow, bleeding and half-conscious. No one was allowed to help him until sundown. Thomas did not watch the lashes. He watched the faces of those around him. Will stared straight ahead, jaw tight. Alice had her head bowed, but her eyes were open. Even Father Aldwin, who had come from the chapel to witness, said nothing. The castle made its point. That night, the servants worked in near silence. No one laughed. No one whispered. But in the chapel, Thomas lit the incense with steady hands. He polished the silver and laid the cloths. When the Lord came in for prayer, Thomas knelt behind him, as always, waiting, listening, and he realized something sharp, like the edge of a blade pressed against the ribs of understanding. Fear was the true architect of the castle, not stone, not wood. Fear, and he was learning to walk its halls without making a sound. The castle had begun to thaw, not from warmth, but from necessity. As winter crawled toward its end, the snow receded in patches like a retreating army, revealing a landscape battered and deadened by cold. The trees remained skeletal. The sky still hung gray and low, but there were signs, subtle, small, the first dripping from the eaves, a faint scent of thawing earth, the shrill cry of birds returning to the treetops. Spring would come, and with it, change, and in the castle, change was never gentle. For the servants, there was no celebration of seasons, no rituals of renewal, only the relentless reshuffling of tasks and faces. When spring approached, it meant the beginning of planting for the village, the mending of what the frost had broken, the scrubbing of soot-blackened stone until every trace of winter was erased. Even the rushes on the floors were replaced, the old ones burned in the courtyard, as if to purify the halls. And with that change came new eyes watching Thomas. He was summoned again to the steward's quarters. This time, not for reprimand or reassignment, but to assist with records. Oswin had begun trusting him with simple transcriptions, lists of grain stores, names of tenants who owed tax, the linen tally for the upper chambers. The steward said little, but Thomas knew the meaning. He was being drawn deeper into the heart of the machine. It was an odd kind of promotion. It brought no reward, no coin, no comfort, but it brought access. He saw maps now, saw names of barons who had not visited in years, of knights stationed along the borderlands, of monks from distant abbeys who sent letters written in Latin he could not yet read. He saw that everything was counted, measured, controlled, and he saw, too, what went missing. One day Oswin left him alone in the record room for an hour. That was when Thomas dared to glance into the locked drawer. The key had been left beside a candle, forgotten or intentionally placed, was hard to tell. Inside the drawer were scrolls bound with red cords, and among them, a list of names, with small marks beside each. At first, he did not understand. But the names were familiar. Too familiar. Will. Al is. Even his own. The marks were tallies, not of work or punishment, but of observation. Notes. One beside Will's name read simply, "Loyal to peers, jokes too freely." Another near Alice's, "Ill-failing no family." And under Thomas's name, "Quiet, precise, chapel, potential." Potential. He closed the drawer, locked it, replaced the key. But the contents seared into his memory like fire. He had known, of course, that the castle watched, that every word, every action, was weighed. But now he saw it in ink. The tallying of lives. He did not speak of it to anyone, not even Alice. She had not recovered. Though she returned to work, her eyes remained sunken, her hands thin and trembling. She no longer smiled, no longer whispered. Thomas left food when he could, but she had begun refusing it. She would not take what could be traced. She had seen what happened to Marian, and even kindness could be punished if it upset the order. One night, as he returned from the chapel, he found her alone in the corridor by the servants' stairs, sitting on the cold stone, legs curled to her chest. "You should be sleeping," he said. "I hear things," she whispered, "at night. When no one else does." He sat beside her. "What things?" "Voices," she said. "From the old tower, the sealed one." He frowned. The western tower had been closed since before he arrived. They said it was unstable, that stones had fallen. No one went there, and no one asked why. "I think someone's inside," Alice said. He didn't answer. She turned toward him. "If I disappear," she said, "don't look for me." He stared at her. "Don't say that." But she was already rising, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders, her steps uneven. That night, Thomas did not sleep. He lay on the straw mat, staring at the ceiling beams, heart tight. The old tower haunted his thoughts. The lady never spoke of it. The steward had never mentioned it. But the priest Father Aldwin had once glanced toward it from the chapel window, and his lips had moved silently, as if in prayer. The next day brought distraction in the form of arrival, a visiting delegation from the north. 2 knights and a cleric entered the castle just after midday, their horses wet with sweat, their cloaks heavy with road dust. The steward greeted them personally. The cleric, tall and severe, was introduced only as Brother Amias. He brought scrolls, many of them, and he carried himself like a man sent to count something deeper than coin. Thomas was summoned to assist with his accommodation as he laid fresh linens on the guest bed. Brother Amias watched him without blinking. His face was long, his eyes pale. "You serve the chapel," the cleric said. Double quotes, "Yes, my lord." And the steward, when called, "Yes." "Do you speak Latin?" "No." "My lord." The cleric said nothing. But as Thomas turned to leave, Brother Amias spoke again. "Do not believe everything the priest tells you. Not all faith is truth." Thomas nodded, though the words chilled him. The castle's priests were untouchable. Even the lady bowed her head in chapel. For a visiting cleric to question Father Aldwin so openly, it was dangerous. But Thomas was beginning to understand that danger wasn't always a whip or a shouted name. Sometimes it came soft. Sometimes it came in letters sealed with wax, in tallies hidden in drawers, in a look held too long 2 days. Later, the cleric requested an escort to the western tower. When the steward refused, citing safety, Brother Amias nodded politely and asked to pray alone instead. That night, a scream echoed through the stone halls. It came from the direction of the west tower, not loud, not long, but unmistakable. And in the silence that followed, the entire servant quarter held its breath. No one spoke of it. No one spoke of it. No one mentioned it the next day. But Alice was gone, her blanket still folded, her space still empty, and not even Will dared ask. Thomas stood in the chapel that morning, incense burning at his feet, and felt nothing but cold behind his ribs. The priest entered as always, silent and solemn, and did not look at him. But later, when the noble guests departed, and the candles had burned low, Thomas approached the altar. "Father," he said, "the girl Lolly, she's gone. Father?" Aldwyn did not answer. She heard something, Thomas continued. From the tower. Still no reply, but as Thomas turned to leave, the priest spoke softly. She asked questions. Thomas froze. "Do not ask questions," the priest said, and then, with eyes that did not blink, "Serve, listen, survive." The days after Alice's disappearance were heavy with silence, the kind that presses in and makes breathing a cautious act. The castle seemed to close around the servants like a tightening noose. Whispers that might once have dared to flutter between the cracks of the stone walls were now swallowed whole by the weight of fear. No one spoke openly about the West Tower, about the scream, or about what might have happened to her. To do so was to invite the same shadow that had claimed her. Thomas felt it too, a shadow creeping at the edges of his thoughts, a cold hand on the back of his neck. But instead of retreating, he felt the strange pull of curiosity growing stronger, an ember lit by Alice's words and fate. He could not unsee what he had glimpsed in the steward's records, or ignore the tension tightening in the chapel's hushed corners. His duties remained as before, polishing the silver chalices, preparing the altar, and assisting Father Aldwyn during the silent, solemn rituals. But now, every movement carried a double weight. Every glance from the steward, every hushed word behind closed doors, felt like a thread pulling him deeper into a web he could not yet understand. The castle was more than stone and mortar, it was a maze of secrets, a vault of whispered power and dangerous knowledge. One evening, as the sun bled red behind the distant hills, Thomas found himself in the servants' quarters, crouched beside Will. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows across the rough walls, and the air was thick with unspoken worries. "They took her," Will whispered, voice rough, "for asking, for knowing too much." Thomas shook his head. "No one knows what they do with those who disappear." Will's eyes narrowed. "They do. It's how the castle keeps control. Fear, silence." Thomas swallowed. He thought of the lashes Rafe had endured, the endless labor, the cold that claimed even the strongest bones. He thought of the Lord's prayers in the chapel, the lady's cold eyes, the steward's calculating gaze, and you. What will happen to you if you ask too much? Will's voice was a low growl. "I don't know," Thomas said, "but I have to try." That night, he returned to the chapel, where the flicker of the sanctuary candle was the only light in the vast darkness. Father Aldwyn awaited him, robes flowing softly, hands folded. "You question," the priest said softly. "That is dangerous." Thomas nodded, swallowing the fear rising in his throat. "Listen carefully," Aldwyn continued. "The castle is not just stone. It is a living thing, built on power, on fear, on silence. It needs its servants to be invisible, obedient, to carry its burdens without complaint." "Why?" Thomas asked, voice barely a whisper. "Because power demands it," the priest replied, "and those who seek to break the chain will be broken themselves." Thomas knelt before the altar, eyes lowered. The weight of the priest's words settled like a stone inside him. Yet, beneath the heaviness, a seed of defiance stirred. In the days that followed, Thomas moved with greater caution. He watched the steward's eyes, noting the subtle flicker of suspicion when Thomas lingered too long near the records. He listened to the murmurs in the halls, piecing together fragments of gossip and fear. The castle spoke in riddles, but he was beginning to understand the language. One afternoon, as he delivered fresh linens to the chamberlain's quarters, he overheard a heated conversation between two knights. Their voices were low, but urgent. The girl vanished near the tower. No one dares to question the lady's orders, and the steward watches closely. No one moves without his leave. Thomas's heart quickened. The net was tightening back in the servants' hall. Will approached him with a look that was both grim and determined. "We can't wait for the lady or the steward to act," he said. "If we don't speak, we'll all vanish like Alice." Thomas nodded, the resolve hardening in his chest. That night, beneath the flickering stars outside the castle walls, Thomas made a decision. He would seek out those who whispered in shadows, those who dared to resist. He would learn their secrets, and maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to break the silence. But the castle does not surrender its secrets easily. As he lay in the cold, surrounded by the murmurs of restless sleepers, Thomas felt the weight of the coming days. The path ahead was dark, fraught with peril, but it was the only path left for a servant who had tasted the bitter truth of power. The first step in any rebellion, Thomas had learned, was silent observation, silent planning, silent gathering. The castle was a fortress not only of stone but of secrets, and those secrets were guarded fiercely. To challenge the walls that held them was to invite collapse. Yet beneath the weight of oppression, a fragile resistance stirred. Like the faintest pulse beneath frozen ground, Thomas found himself drawn toward the shadows where whispered defiance lived. In the dim recesses of the servants' quarters, in the dark corners behind the kitchens, hushed voices spoke of hope and fear. Some spoke of escape, others of justice. Most spoke in riddles, afraid to say too much. Will was his closest ally. The two moved cautiously, exchanging scraps of information and stolen moments of trust. Will's humor, though muted, remained a balm against the cold reality. He told stories of distant lands where servants were free, where voices carried beyond the walls, and names meant more than chains. One evening, Thomas met a woman named Miriam in the laundry room. She was older than most servants, with eyes sharp as flint and a voice quiet but commanding. Miriam had arrived at the castle long before Thomas and whispered of times when the lady's rule was less cruel, when the steward's grip was lighter. "You seek answers," Miriam said, fixing Thomas with a steady gaze. "But the castle's walls are thick. The stones remember. The stones speak, but only to those who listen." Thomas nodded, feeling the truth in her words. Miriam introduced him. Two other servants who had lost family, who bore scars hidden beneath their clothes, who carried stories too heavy for daylight. They met in secret, sharing what little they could, building a fragile web of solidarity. But the castle's gaze was always watching. One night, as Thomas left the chapel, he caught sight of the steward's men moving through the corridors. Their footsteps deliberate, their eyes sharp. A sudden chill ran through him. He was being followed. He quickened his pace, heart pounding, weaving through narrow passages and silent rooms. But the castle was a maze, and the guards knew every turn. They caught him near the kitchen doors. "You are far from where you belong." "Thomas," one guard said, grip tightening on his arm, "just returning from my duties." Thomas replied, voice steady despite the rising fear. The guard sneered. "The steward wishes to speak with you, now." In the steward's chamber, Oswald sat behind his desk, expression unreadable. The room was cold, lit only by a flickering candle. "You have been seen speaking with Miriam," Oswald said. "Tell me, Thomas, what do you hope to gain?" Thomas met his gaze. "Only to survive." Oswald smiled, but it was not kind. "Survival comes from obedience, not rebellion." The steward's words hung heavy in the air. Thomas understood then that his every move was weighed, his every word tracked. The castle was not just a place, it was a cage, and he was trapped inside. Yet, even as Oswald spoke, Thomas felt a spark inside him. A defiance that could not be crushed by stone or fear. "I will obey," Thomas said quietly, "but I will not forget." Oswald leaned forward, voice dropping to a whisper. "Then be careful what you remember." Released, Thomas returned to the servants' quarters, where Will awaited with a grave expression. "They know," Will said simply. Thomas nodded. "But we cannot stop. Not now." Together, they planned their next steps, knowing the risks. The castle's shadows were deep, but so was their resolve. Outside, the first green shoots of spring pushed through the thawing earth. Inside, the servants braced for the battles yet to come. The dawn brought with it a thin veil of mist, curling through the castle's narrow alleys and clutching at the stone walls like a secret. Thomas rose early, his limbs stiff from restless sleep. The weight of yesterday's encounter with Oswald lingered heavily, yet it fueled a strange blend of caution and determination. The castle was no longer merely a place of service, it had become a battleground, and he was a player he could neither fully understand nor easily escape. He moved quietly through the corridors, blending with the shadows as he always had. His eyes traced the familiar patterns, the worn stones in the hallways, the chipped plaster above the arched doorways, the faint scratches on the wooden beams left by countless hands over decades. Every mark was a story. Every stone held memory. But beneath those memories lay a deeper truth. Power, silent and ruthless, shaped every breath taken within these walls. In the servants' hall, murmurs rippled like waves breaking against stone. Miriam and Will waited for him, their faces tense but resolute. They spoke in hushed tones, careful to avoid ears that might carry their words straight to the steward. "There's a weakness," Miriam said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not in the walls, but in the people who uphold them. We must find it." Thomas nodded, the spark within him igniting brighter. He had seen it too in fleeting glances, in whispered conversations, in the subtle fractures beneath the lady's cold veneer. Their plan was simple, yet dangerous. They would gather information, seek allies, and wait for the right moment. Escape was folly. Instead, they aimed to unravel the control from within, to make the invisible visible, to make silence speak. The following days passed in a tense rhythm of observation and secrecy. Thomas continued his duties in the chapel, absorbing the prayers and confessions, noting the shifting alliances beneath the piety. He caught fleeting glimpses of the steward's growing suspicion, felt the tightening noose of surveillance. One evening, as he polished the silver chalices, Father Aldwin approached him, a rare softness in his eyes. "You carry burdens not meant for a servant," the priest said quietly. "Beware the weight." Thomas met his gaze steadily. "I must bear them, for those who cannot." A faint smile touched Aldwin's lips. "Then trust carefully. Not all who serve the chapel serve the same masters." The words lingered, a puzzle piece falling into place. That night, beneath the cloak of darkness, Thomas joined Miriam and Will in the hidden corners of the castle. Their small group grew as whispers spread. Other servants, some seasoned and weary, others young and desperate, all drawn by the fragile hope of change. They spoke of names, guards who could be bribed, messages hidden in bread deliveries, secrets whispered during late-night vigils. Each piece added to the tapestry of resistance. Yet danger loomed close. One afternoon, Thomas noticed unfamiliar faces among the steward's men, new recruits with cold eyes and sharper tongues. Their presence was a warning. The castle's walls were closing in. Despite the peril, the resolve within the servants hardened. They were no longer shadows. They were a force gathering strength in silence. As spring deepened, the castle began to stir with unrest. The ladies' orders grew stricter, the steward's patrols more frequent. But beneath the surface, the servants moved with newfound purpose. Thomas, once a boy carrying firewood, was now a thread in a larger design, one woven from courage, fear, and the relentless pursuit of freedom. The castle had become their world and their prison, but even the darkest walls could crack. The castle's walls seemed to close tighter with every passing day. And yet, beneath the suffocating weight of authority, a subtle pulse of defiance began to thrum, a rhythm felt only by those who dared to listen. Thomas had become more than just a servant. He was a conduit of whispered hopes, a keeper of fragile secrets that could topple the delicate balance between power and submission. Spring's chill still lingered in the morning air, but the days grew longer, carrying with them the promise of change. The lady's gaze grew colder, sharper, as if she sensed the shifting tides beneath her feet. The steward's watchfulness was relentless, his men patrolling corridors with calculated precision. Yet Thomas and his growing circle moved carefully, weaving through the castle like smoke, intangible, unseen, but ever present. Miriam's eyes, sharp and knowing, had become the group's beacon. She spoke of alliances, quiet alliances in the castle's shadowed corners. "Not all who wear fine clothes are enemies," she reminded them. "Some are prisoners too." Thomas nodded, understanding the dangerous game they played. Trust was currency, and betrayal was the coin that could buy freedom or death. One afternoon, as Thomas delivered fresh linens to the ladies' chambers, he overheard a conversation that tightened his chest like a vice. The lady spoke with the steward, in low, urgent tones. "The northern border grows restless," she said. "If the peasants rise, the castle must hold firm. No weaknesses." Oswin nodded. "The servants must be watched. The smallest spark can ignite a fire." The words hung heavy in the air. Later, in the chapel, Father Aldwin gave Thomas a look that was both warning and encouragement. "Faith is a double-edged sword," he murmured. "It can bind or it can free." Thomas held on to those words as he returned to the servants' quarters. The whispers grew louder, now tales of strange noises from the west tower, of shadows moving where none should. Fear coiled tightly around the hearts of the servants. But so did determination. One night, under a sky veiled with clouds, Thomas and his allies met in the hidden cellar beneath the old kitchens. The air was damp, filled with the scent of earth and forgotten time. "We have to act," Miriam said. "We cannot wait for mercy that will never come." Plans were drawn in whispered tones, routes to avoid patrols, messages concealed in laundry deliveries, and signals hidden in the shifting patterns of firelight. But the castle's eyes were everywhere. A betrayal came swift and silent. A servant, tempted by promises or broken by fear, revealed the secret gatherings to the steward. The next dawn, the castle awoke to harsh orders and sudden arrests. Thomas watched from the shadows as friends were dragged away, faces pale, eyes wide with shock and defiance. The castle's grip tightened, but the spark had already ignited in the chapel. As incense curled toward the high vaulted ceilings, Thomas knelt in silent prayer, not for mercy, but for strength. The path ahead was fraught with peril, and yet, beneath the cold stone and iron bars, hope endured. The castle's heart had turned cold and hard. The arrests sent a shudder through the servants' quarters, a warning carved into flesh and memory. Faces once familiar now bore the marks of fear and absence. The whispered defiance that had flickered like a candle in the dark was quickly drowned in the storm of suspicion and cruelty. Thomas felt the weight of those losses deeply, the heavy silence pressing down as he moved through the halls. He no longer trusted the familiar rhythms of his daily tasks. Each glance over his shoulder, each quiet footstep, carried the risk of discovery. Yet, within him, the ember of resistance refused to die. Father Aldwin's presence became a fragile thread of hope. Though bound by vows, the priest's eyes betrayed a knowing sorrow, as if he carried the pain of the castle's secrets himself. One evening, in the sanctuary's dim glow, Aldwin spoke quietly to Thomas. "Faith can be a shield, but it can also be a blade," he said. "Be cautious, but do not lose your courage." Thomas absorbed the words like water to a parched earth. The lady's influence had tightened its grip as well. Her cold gaze seemed to pierce through stone and shadow, demanding absolute obedience. Servants were summoned for inspection. Tasks were doubled, and the punishment for the smallest misstep was swift and brutal. The castle's walls, once a place of routine, had become a cage where hope struggled to breathe. Yet, even in the darkest hours, pockets of resistance endured. Miriam's network had shrunk, but had not disappeared. The few remaining met in secret, sharing stories of those taken, piecing together plans that balanced desperation and resolve. Thomas found himself at the center of this fragile web. His role in the chapel granted him access to the castle's hidden corners and whispered conversations. He became a messenger, a keeper of truths that dared not speak aloud. One night, as snow began to dust the earth once more, Thomas was entrusted with a secret message. It was folded into a scrap of cloth, hidden beneath the folds of his tunic. The words within spoke of a distant abbey, a potential ally beyond the castle walls, a hope for aid or sanctuary. The journey was dangerous, impossible even for a servant, but it was a spark, a chance. As Thomas held the message close, he felt the full weight of what was at stake. The castle was a living thing, breathing fear and control. But it was also a prison that could be broken. The question was how. The morning sun struggled to break through heavy clouds as Thomas stepped back into the cold embrace of the world beyond the abbey walls. The respite he had found within those ancient stones was brief but vital, a flicker of warmth in the relentless chill of his journey. His limbs still ached from the forest's cruel grasp, yet his spirit carried a new weight. The promise that change was possible. The monk's words echoed in his mind. The walls of power are thick, but cracks exist. It was a fragile truth, but one he clung to with desperate hope. Thomas knew that returning to the castle would be the most perilous part of his mission. The hidden postern gate was watched more closely now, and whispers of rebellion had stirred the air into a tense silence. Every shadow could harbor an enemy. Every footstep might signal betrayal. As he moved cautiously through the darkened forest, memories of the castle haunted him, the cold stone halls, the stern gaze of the steward, the vanishing of Alice, the flicker of resistance kindled in secret corners. Those memories fueled his steps, making the biting cold and aching muscles almost bearable. Back within the castle walls, the atmosphere had thickened. The lady's presence was felt in every command, every glance, every tightened order. The steward's men patrolled with renewed vigilance, searching for the faintest hint of dissent. The servants, once united by whispered hope, now moved in fractured fear. Thomas slipped through the shadows, clutching the message that could change everything. His return was met with wary eyes and hushed warnings. Miriam greeted him in the servants' quarters, her face pale but resolute. "You've done what few could," she said quietly. "Now the true test begins." Together, they pored over the monk's reply, a call for patience, for careful planning, for allies to be found not just beyond the walls but within them. The abbey could offer sanctuary and support, but the seeds of change had to be sown inside. The castle first. Thomas's role shifted from messenger to strategist. He and Miriam began to identify those among the servants, and even the lower-ranking guards, who might be swayed to their cause, those whose loyalty to the lady was fragile, whose fear might be turned to courage, but betrayal lurked in the air. One evening, as Thomas returned from a secret meeting, he found the servants' hall empty, the usual hum of quiet conversation replaced by an oppressive silence. A sudden clatter echoed from the steward's quarters, the unmistakable sound of conflict. Rushing toward the noise, Thomas witnessed a guard dragging Miriam through the hall, her face set in defiance despite bruises and exhaustion. "Traitor!" The guard spat. Thomas's heart hammered as he stepped forward, but the guard shoved him back with brutal force. "Stay out of this." "Servant," the man growled. Miriam's eyes met Thomas's for a fleeting moment, a silent plea and a promise, wrapped in pain. That night, as the castle settled into uneasy quiet, Thomas sat alone, the weight of loss pressing upon him. Yet even in the darkest moments, the fire within him burned brighter, a beacon for those who still dared to hope. The castle was a fortress, yes, but even the strongest walls had weaknesses, and Thomas was determined to find them. The following days passed in a blur of tension and whispered caution. Miriam's arrest cast a long shadow across the servants' quarters. Her absence was felt like a wound, sharp, aching, a stark reminder of the cost of resistance within the castle's unforgiving walls. The once muted murmur of rebellion now trembled, threatened by fear and loss. But Thomas refused to let despair consume him. He carried Miriam's spirit in his heart, a spark of courage that fueled every step he took through the labyrinthine corridors and cold chambers. The castle was a living entity, shaped not only by stone and mortar but by the will of those who inhabited it. It fed on silence but could be starved by defiance. Father Aldwin's cryptic words echoed in his mind. Not all who serve the chapel serve the same masters. The priest's allegiance was unclear, but his subtle support was a beacon in the encroaching darkness. One evening, as Thomas tended the altar, Aldwin slipped him a small folded note, a map of secret passages beneath the castle. Hidden routes long forgotten by the nobles above. "This may save lives," Aldwin whispered. "Use it wisely." The map was a revelation. It spoke of tunnels carved into the bedrock, passages that connected the servants' quarters to the outer walls and beyond. Escape, or movement unseen, was possible. Thomas shared the secret with Will and the few trusted allies who remained. Hope stirred anew. They could move without fear, communicate, gather without detection. But the castle was restless. The ladies' wrath grew fiercer with each act of defiance. Punishments became crueler. One night, Thomas heard the screams of a fellow servant accused of theft and heresy echo through the halls. The price of resistance was steep. Yet, beneath the surface, the resistance took shape like a growing storm. They planned carefully, striking with precision, avoiding unnecessary bloodshed but making their presence known. Messages left in laundry baskets, signals in the flicker of candlelight, silent protests in the form of missing tools or delayed tasks. Thomas's role became crucial: messenger, strategist, symbol. His courage inspired those around him, reminding them that even in the darkest dungeons, a flame could burn. Outside the castle, the world shifted as well. Rumors of unrest in the surrounding lands reached the castle gates. Peasants whispered of rebellion, nobles whispered of war. The castle's walls, once a refuge, now felt like a cage bracing for a storm. In the quiet moments, Thomas reflected on how far he had come from a nameless servant to a beacon of hope. The path was fraught with danger, but he was ready to face whatever came, because he understood now that true power was not held in titles or stone, but in the courage to rise. The castle, long a bastion of authority and silence, now pulsed with a quiet revolution. Thomas felt the change ripple through its very foundations. The servants, once bowed by fear, now held their heads a little higher, their glances a little sharper. They moved with purpose, though always in shadows, always wary of the ever-watchful eyes of the steward's men. Thomas had become more than a servant. He was a symbol, a flicker of resistance that refused to be snuffed out. His footsteps echoed in hidden corridors, carrying whispered words of hope. The secret tunnels, mapped by Father Aldwin, offered lifelines, unseen arteries beneath the castle, allowing messages and people to flow undetected. But the lady's grip tightened. The halls that once echoed with the clatter of daily life now resounded with the harsh whispers of suspicion and command. Punishments were meted with ruthless precision, a reminder that rebellion bore a high cost. The scars on the backs of servants told stories of pain and resilience alike. One cold evening, as the firelight flickered weakly in the servants' hall, Thomas gathered with his closest allies. Miriam's absence was a wound still fresh, but her spirit lingered in their resolve. "We move soon," Thomas said, voice steady. "We cannot wait for mercy. The time has come to act." Plans unfolded, small acts of defiance, coordinated disruptions designed to shake the foundations of power without inviting total destruction. They would strike at the steward's stores, delay the delivery of food, spread rumors that would unsettle the lady's confidence. The risks were immense. Failure meant not just punishment, but death or disappearance, like Alice and Miriam. Yet, the weight of years under oppression had broken the will of many, and a desperate hope stirred in the hearts of those who remained outside. The winds of change whispered through the village beyond the walls. News of uprisings in distant lands filtered into the castle, carried by travelers and merchants. The nobles spoke of rebellion with fear, and of the need for iron order. But Thomas knew that iron, no matter how strong, could be bent in the stillness. Before the coming storm, he stood in the chapel once more. The flicker of candlelight cast long shadows on stone walls etched with centuries of prayer and power. He knelt, not in submission, but in silent vow, to survive, to resist, to reclaim a life stolen by stone and silence. The air in the castle had grown thick with tension, like the heavy fog that clings to the moors at dawn, silent but all-encompassing. The servants moved through the stone halls with careful steps, hearts pounding beneath layers of worn fabric and hidden courage. The time for subtle whispers was fading. The moment for action was drawing near. Thomas stood at the center of the growing resistance, his resolve hardened by loss and hope alike. The secret tunnels Father Aldwin had revealed became arteries of communication and movement, allowing the servants to coordinate without fear of discovery. Plans were laid with precision, small acts that could disrupt the lady's hold without sparking outright slaughter. The first strike was subtle but effective, a delay in the delivery of grain from the storerooms, the spoiling of preserved food. A faint trail of rumors whispered to the lady's closest advisors. Each ripple sent shockwaves through the rigid order of the castle, unsettling the steward and forcing the lady to question the loyalty she had long taken for granted. But the castle was unforgiving. Retribution came swiftly. Servants were questioned, punished, sometimes vanished without a trace. The specter of Alice and Miriam haunted every corridor, a chilling reminder of the price of defiance. Yet the rebellion grew not in numbers alone, but in spirit. Those who remained were bound by a shared belief that even stone could crumble and silence could be shattered. One evening, as the sun bled crimson behind the distant hills, Thomas found himself in the chapel once more. The flickering candlelight illuminated the carved stone altar, worn by centuries of prayer. Father Aldwin stood beside him, a quiet understanding in his gaze. "Your path is perilous," the priest said softly, "but remember, even the darkest night is broken by dawn." Thomas nodded, feeling the weight of those words settle deep within him. He was no longer just a servant. He was a bearer of hope, a whisper of freedom against the cold might of the castle. Outside, the world itself seemed to tremble. Rumors of rebellion spread through the villages, and distant battles echoed like thunder on the horizon. The castle's walls, once symbols of unyielding power, now felt fragile, as if the winds of change could topple them at any moment. In that moment, Thomas made a silent vow. He would fight not with sword or shield, but with courage, with cunning. with the unyielding will of those who refused to be broken. The final chapter was approaching. The castle stood silent beneath the gathering storm, its ancient stones bearing witness to centuries of power, of control, of lives lived in the shadow of its walls. But within its cold embrace, something new stirred a restless tide that refused to be contained. Thomas moved through the halls with quiet purpose, his every step echoing the courage born from years of hardship and hope. The rebellion, once a fragile whisper, had become a resolute voice, rising beneath the lady's cold gaze and the steward's watchful eye. The secret tunnels beneath the castle hummed with movement, servants and allies weaving through the labyrinth, their hearts pounding in unison. The acts of defiance, small but precise, had unsettled the balance. The lady's authority, once absolute, now faltered under the weight of fear and uncertainty. One night, as the moon hung low and silver over the battlements, the castle's silence was broken by the murmur of footsteps and the faint clinking of makeshift weapons. The servants, no longer invisible, gathered with a fierce determination, ready to reclaim their lives from the grip of stone and silence. Thomas stood at the forefront, as a servant, but as a symbol of resilience and hope. His eyes met those of his comrades, each one carrying stories of loss and dreams of freedom. The first clash was swift and chaotic, a storm unleashed within the walls. The lady's guards, trained and armed, met the surge with force, but the servants, moved with desperation and courage born of years beneath the yoke of oppression. Stone met will. Fear met defiance. Silence met the roar of voices rising in rebellion, in the chaos. Thomas fought not with sword or shield, but with the fierce spirit of those who had nothing left to lose. The castle shook with the sounds of struggle, its walls bearing witness to the unyielding human spirit. As dawn broke, the lady's power waned, and the steward's grip loosened. The servants emerged from the shadows, not as shadows, but as people reclaiming their stories, their dignity, their lives. The castle, once a prison, became a testament not to power wielded without mercy, but to the courage that can rise from the darkest places. Thomas stood among them, the morning light warming his face, knowing that the road ahead was long and uncertain. But for the first time, he tasted freedom not just from chains, but from silence. The story of a servant in a medieval castle was no longer one of submission, but of survival, resistance, and hope. And in that, the castle's true legacy was forged.